For most of us, Spain means modern roads, fast trains, crowded resorts, and the polished image of European infrastructure at its best. It is the kind of country where massive projects are supposed to feel rational, efficient, and carefully planned. The assumption is simple. In Europe, infrastructure is built where it makes sense. Demand is studied. Routes are calculated. Budgets are justified. Every euro is supposed to serve a purpose. But in the heart of Spain, far from the coast and far from the world's postcard image of the country, there is a place where all of that confidence collapses. Out among the dry plains of Castile-La Mancha stands one of the strangest monuments to ambition in modern Europe. A giant airport. Built at enormous cost. Designed with grand expectations. Equipped like a serious international hub. And yet, only a few years after opening, it failed. Today, it stands as one of the most expensive infrastructure disasters in Spanish history. This is the story of how Spain built a billion-euro airport that failed. To understand how something this large could go so wrong, you have to begin with the dream behind it. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Spain was living through a period of optimism, construction, and easy money. Across the country, there was a growing belief that expansion itself was proof of progress. New highways, new housing developments, new rail links, and new megaprojects all seemed to point in the same direction. Bigger meant better. Growth looked permanent. Ambition looked safe. And in Castile-La Mancha, local authorities and influential businessmen wanted their own transformation. This was not one of Spain's richest or most dynamic regions. It was dry, flat, rural, and lightly populated. Vineyards, sheep, and endless plains defined the landscape. It was not a natural center of international travel. It was not an obvious aviation hotspot. But that was exactly why the project's backers saw opportunity there. They did not want to work with what the region already was. They wanted to reinvent it. The plan was bold. Build a huge, modern airport in the middle of inland Spain and turn the region into a major transport hub. It would attract airlines, tourists, investors, and development. It would create jobs. It would raise the region's status. And it would prove that private ambition could do something historic. This was not planned as a modest regional airport. It was designed on a grand scale from the very beginning. Its runway stretched to around 4,000 meters, long enough to handle some of the largest aircraft in the world. Massive jets like the Boeing 747 and Airbus A380 could land there without difficulty. The terminal was sleek and modern. Glass, steel, broad halls, check-in systems, retail spaces, and parking areas all gave it the appearance of a serious international gateway. It was built not as a backup airfield, but as a statement. And the statement was clear. This place was meant to matter. The logic behind the project centered on one major promise: Madrid. A high-speed rail line already ran nearby, and the idea was to connect the airport to the capital through a dedicated station. In theory, passengers could land at this remote airport and reach central Madrid in under an hour. Airlines would benefit from lower fees and less congestion than at Madrid's main airport. Travelers would still have access to the capital. And the inland region would suddenly gain a powerful economic engine. On paper, it sounded visionary. In practice, it already contained the seeds of failure. Because one basic question never disappeared. Why here? Why build one of the country's most ambitious airports in a place with no major city next to it? Why assume millions of people would choose a remote terminal and then continue their journey onward, instead of simply flying directly into Madrid? Why build massive capacity before proving that real demand even existed? Those questions were easy to ignore while optimism was high. During boom years, unrealistic ideas often feel bold instead of dangerous. Easy credit can make fantasy look like strategy. Political ambition can turn oversized plans into symbols of pride. And once enough people repeat the same story, doubt starts to look like negativity. So construction moved forward. Concrete spread across the plains. Steel and glass rose out of the dry landscape. Roads, parking zones, access routes, and technical facilities took shape. What had once been open countryside was transformed into a giant airport complex. To local residents, it must have looked surreal. A futuristic transport hub was appearing in the middle of fields and pastures, as if a major world city had been planned for a place that had never needed one. The symbolism was powerful. This was not just infrastructure. It was a promise. A promise that this quiet region was about to become something much bigger. And then the airport opened. At first, there were signs that the dream might work. Flights began. Some low-cost carriers showed interest. The terminal welcomed its first passengers. Cameras recorded the opening. The project's supporters celebrated what looked like a major achievement. For a brief moment, the vision seemed alive. But behind the polished surfaces, the economics were already breaking down. The airport had cost around €1.1 billion. That made it one of the most expensive projects of its kind in Spain. Much of the funding came through debt, including loans from regional banks that believed future success would justify the risk. Everything depended on one assumption. The airport had to be used. And that is where the whole structure began to collapse. Passenger numbers never grew the way investors had hoped. The region itself did not generate enough natural demand. The airport was too remote to become an obvious first choice for most travelers. The promised transport convenience turned out to be far less convincing in reality than it had looked in presentations and speeches. Then timing made the problem even worse. The airport opened just as the global financial crisis of 2008 hit. This was devastating. Travel demand fell across Europe. Airlines cut weak or unprofitable routes. Investors became cautious. The era of effortless growth was suddenly over. Projects that had depended on aggressive optimism were now exposed to the full force of economic reality. And this airport had been built on aggressive optimism from the very start. It had been built for scale. But scale became a burden. Huge halls had to be cleaned. Systems had to stay running. Staff had to be paid. Electricity, security, maintenance, and operations all cost money whether passengers arrived or not. A giant airport with only a trickle of traffic is not a sleeping asset. It is a machine for burning money. That was the trap. The more impressive the airport was, the more expensive it became to operate at low volume. And low volume is exactly what it got. The strategic logic also began falling apart under pressure. Madrid already had a powerful airport of its own, and it was not about to surrender its role quietly. For most travelers, it remained much easier and more convenient to land in Madrid itself than to fly into a remote inland airport and then continue onward. The missing railway connection only made things worse. The project's most important promise had been fast access to the capital, but that promise never fully materialized in the way investors needed. What looked like a clean integrated system on paper became an awkward detour in real life. And once that perception took hold, it was incredibly hard to reverse. Low-cost carriers started leaving. Routes were cut. Traffic weakened further. The terminal's huge halls, designed for thousands of passengers, began to feel disturbingly empty. There were moments when only a few people moved through spaces built for crowds. Automatic doors opened. Escalators kept moving. Lights remained on. Employees continued reporting for work. But the life inside the airport never matched the size of the structure around it. That contrast is what made the place so haunting. It was not a ruin in the classic sense. It was something stranger. A modern machine, still standing, still polished, still expensive, but already losing its purpose. At night, it reportedly glowed in the darkness of the fields like a giant futuristic object that had landed in the wrong place. Inside, silence was beginning to replace movement. Dust slowly began to settle over a project that had been designed for constant motion. It had not been built to decay. But it had been built for a future that never arrived. By 2012, the experiment was effectively over. The last commercial flight left. The airport closed. For a project of this size, that is an astonishingly short lifespan. Years of planning, massive construction, and enormous spending had produced an airport that functioned as intended for only a brief stretch of time. Then came the financial aftermath. The owners entered bankruptcy. Debts mounted. Creditors moved in. Courts got involved. The airport passed into legal and financial limbo. And at that point, the project entered a new and even stranger phase. It became an asset that nobody really wanted. Maintaining an empty airport still cost money. Security still mattered. Preservation still mattered. Systems still needed some level of support. The Spanish climate could quickly damage an unprotected site. Even in failure, the airport continued demanding resources. That turned it into a financial dead end. The more time passed, the harder it became to recover any meaningful share of what had been spent. And yet, because the site was so unusual, it did not become totally useless. Film crews used it. Car companies used the runway for testing. Its silence, emptiness, and scale made it useful as scenery. In a strange way, the airport found a second life, not as transportation infrastructure, but as a stage. That may be one of the most surreal parts of the whole story. A giant airport built to move millions of people ended up being more useful as an abandoned backdrop than as an actual airport. But even that did not solve the deeper problem. The place was still too large, too expensive, and too disconnected from the purpose for which it had been created. Then came the resale process. And that is where the scale of failure became impossible to hide. Authorities and creditors tried to sell the airport and recover something from the wreckage. But buyer interest was weak. Auctions failed. Prices fell. The project that had consumed around €1.1 billion was gradually transformed, in market terms, from a monument of ambition into an object of mockery. At one point, a notoriously tiny offer drew public outrage because it seemed absurdly low compared with the original investment. Whether every rumor around those negotiations was true or not, the symbolism was devastating. What had once been sold as a transformational project had become a national embarrassment. Eventually, in 2018, the airport was sold for only a small fraction of what had been spent building it. That final number made the lesson brutally clear. This was not just a weak investment. It was collapse. The market had delivered its verdict. The vision had failed. The infrastructure remained, but the logic behind it had been shattered. Today, the site survives in a much humbler form. Its runway and dry climate make it useful for aircraft storage, maintenance-related activity, and logistics functions that are far less glamorous than the dream that created it. Planes can be parked there. Equipment can be stored there. Warehousing and secondary uses are possible. But that is not what this place was supposed to be. It was supposed to be a thriving international gateway. Instead, it became a lesson. And that is what makes the story so powerful. Not just that the airport failed, but how it failed. It failed because ambition ran ahead of reality. Because scale replaced logic. Because planners treated infrastructure as if size alone could create importance. Because technology was mistaken for strategy. Because investors and officials convinced themselves that if they built something massive enough, the world would reorganize itself around it. But real infrastructure does not work that way. Airports do not succeed because they look modern. They do not succeed because their runway is huge. They do not succeed because politicians want a region transformed. They succeed because they are in the right place, connected to real demand, and built to solve a genuine need. This airport did not do that. It tried to manufacture importance instead of earning it. And when the economic climate changed, there was nothing strong enough underneath the dream to hold it up. In that sense, the airport became more than a failed aviation project. It became a monument to an era. An era of easy credit. Of political vanity. Of overbuilt ambition. Of confidence so inflated that concrete and glass were treated as substitutes for sound judgment. Spain paid a huge price for that lesson. And the result still stands in the plains of La Mancha, not as a gateway to the future, but as a warning. Because in the end, this story is not really about planes. It is about what happens when ambition loses contact with reality. It is about what happens when billion-euro projects are built on fantasy instead of need. And it is about how even in a country known for modern infrastructure, one of the most expensive projects of its time could still become a giant monument to error. €1 billion were spent. A grand vision was sold. A massive airport was built. And yet, for all that steel, glass, and concrete, it never truly got off the ground.